Can you imagine a world where bank pays negative interest, where borrowers get paid and savers penalized? Crazy as it sounds, several countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Switzerland cut interest rate below zero in 2014 and now followed by Japan in mid-2016. In this video, we are going to discuss on the negative interest rate in Japan. So what is negative interest rate policy? It is an unconventional monetary policy tool whereby nominal target interest rates are set with a negative value below the theoretical lower bound of 0%. In September 20th, 2016, the New York Times released an article regarding Japan's negative interest rate, stating that the Japan Central Bank is reviewing its economic policies, asking why they have failed to kickstart growth as intended. One target is negative interest rates, an unconventional tactic adopted in Japan and Europe that turns the usual rule of borrowing and lending upside down. We know that the negative interest rates mean depositors pay money to save their money, and in this case, the depositors are banks. Normally, people who keep money in the local account receive a small amount of interest in return, but with negative rates, central bank charge a fee instead. The idea is to encourage banks to put their money to more productive use, lending it to households and businesses. Negative rates are supposed to then ripple through the economy by lowering the cost of borrowing for everyone, something that should encourage economic growth. The bank is trying to lift the consumer prices, which have been sliding for most of the past 20 years. But the bank efforts are foundering. Its main tool has been an extensive bond buying program. Bond buying injects money into a country's financial system. From there, it is supposed to flow to the rest of the economy. Is it working? The negative rate have succeeded making money in Japan even cheaper. The yield on the 10-year government bonds, for instance, fell below zero in February, meaning investors are lending the government money knowing that they will not be repaid in full. Are the people happy that money is cheap? Well, not the bankers. Between the new fees they are paying the central bank and the general decline in lending income, profits at commercial banks are being squeezed by negative rates.
Monetary policy. Monetary policy is demand-side policy which carried out by the central bank in each country. How to differentiate central bank and commercial bank? Central bank is defined as a government financial institution, while for commercial bank is a financial institution which may be private or public. The main function of central bank that I want to highlight is to conduct monetary policy, which will be discussed later. And the main function for commercial bank are hold deposits for their customers, make loans to their customers, and transfer funds by check. Money market and rate of interest. Monetary policy impacts indirectly on aggregate demand through rate of interest. First of all, what is interest? Interest is payment for the loan in addition to repay the principal, while as rate of interest is percentage of the principal to be paid per year. For example, let's say you want to borrow 1,000 ringgit for 1 year at the rate of interest of 10% per year, and at the end of the year you must pay back the principal of 1,000 ringgit plus 100 ringgit of interest. So how the rate of interest is determined? Well, the rate of interest is determined by the money market. Okay, what is meant by money? Money is defined as anything that is acceptable as payment for goods and services. So what is money market? Money market is a market where the demand for money and the supply of money determine the equilibrium rate of interest. As we look in figure 11, which illustrates money market at equilibrium, where the horizontal axis measures the quantity of money in the economy and the vertical axis measures the rate of interest. Demand for money shows the relationship between the rate of interest and quantity of money demanded. So the relationship is, as the rate of interest falls, the quantity of money demanded increase, which explain the downward sloping shape of a demand curve. The supply of money is fixed as it decided by central bank and does not depend on the rate of interest. That's why the supply of money illustrated in figure 11 as a vertical line, because it does not depend on the rate of interest. So if the central bank changes the money supply, the supply of money curve shift, thus determine a new rate of interest. This is shown in the figure 12, Supposedly, the money supply is at Sm, with demand for money is Dm. The equilibrium rate of interest is IR. If the central bank increases the money supply, Sm2 shifts to Sm1, and the equilibrium rate of interest falls to IR1. And if the central bank decreases the money supply, Sm shifts to Sm2, and the equilibrium rate of interest rises to IR2. So we can conclude, as the increase in the supply of money leads to a fall in the rate of interest, while a decrease in the supply of money leads to an increase in the rate of interest. In the article, Japanese central bank applies expansionary monetary policy. So the central bank decides to increase the money supply, causing a rightward shift in the supply of one curve, and with the constant demand of money, the interest rate will fall. So cost of borrowing will be lower, then cause the consumers and firms to borrow more. So the consumption spending C and investment spending I will be increased. As a result, aggregate demand will be increased and eddy curve shift to the right.
What's long-term interest rate? It reflects A, real interest rate, and B, long-term inflationary expectations or inflation premium as shown in the equation. Nominal long-term interest rate equals real interest rate plus inflation premium. So, market participants, financial institutions, and investors can use long-term government bonds to guard inflation within their portfolios. Now, because long-term interest rate depends on market participants, it's called market rate. As we can see, the nominal interest rate will be negative if the inflation premium exceeds the real interest rate. However, the investors would still have an incentive to invest in long-term government bonds as the real interest rate remains positive. Now, what is short-term interest rate? Interest rates whose maturity is less than a year. They're significantly influenced by the central bank's interest rate policy. Unlike long-term interest rate, short-term interest rate is not market rate as they're influenced by the central bank. Thus, it reflects a monetary policy strategy to boost inflationary expectations in an extraordinary situation, when the market participants anticipate very low or negative long-term inflation, as reflected in the long-term interest rate. What about yield curve spread? Is the difference between the long-term interest rate and short-term interest rate as shown in the following equation. Yield curve spread equals long-term interest rate minus short-term interest rate. Given that long-term interest rate reflect the market's inflationary expectations while the short-term reflects the monetary policy, the long-term and short-term interest rate can move in different directions depending on the effectiveness of monetary policy in managing inflation. Thus, the yield curve spread is the key leading economic indicator realizing the struggle between the inflationary expectations and inflation targeting, and thus significantly affect the business cycle. Generally, a wide yield curve spread stimulates economic growth through credit expansion, whereas a narrow yield curve spread restrains the economic growth through credit contraction. Specifically, since banks borrow funds at a short-term rate and lend to consumers at long-term rate, the bank's profit increases as the yield curve spread widens, which encourages more lending and stimulates economic growth. Similarly, as the yield curve flattens or inverses, banks are less likely to lend, which negatively affects the economy. Thus, central banks are able to affect the business cycle by managing the yield curve spread or setting the short-term interest rate in relation to the level of long-term interest rate. Remember, the actual level of long-term interest rate is the key predictor of an eventual level of short-term rates during the monetary policy implementation stage, as central banks specifically target the yield curve spread in managing the business cycle.
Just like any other aspect, negative interest rates also has its pros and cons. So what are the pros and cons of negative interest rates anyway? Well, the cons first. It can harm the banking sector. As commercial banks make money by charging interest on loans rather than deposits, they have positive net interest margin. But due to negative interest rates, banks' net interest margin is compressed tighter. Second, negative interest rates can cause futile currency war due to weaker exchange rate. The global economy cannot engineer a currency devaluation against itself. So competitive currency devaluation may give way to protectionist trade policies, which would be negative for global growth. Third, negative interest rates may indicate that there's a limit what monetary policy can do to help central banks. Markets are concerned on how central banks can deal with this situation and how policymakers are going to handle it. Now, we move on to the advantages of negative interest rates. First, some negative interest rate policies applies to only about 10% of commercial bank reserves at the central bank, mostly attracting a zero or marginally positive interest rate. Second, markets believe that negative interest rates improve long-term growth prospects, raising interest rates in the future, resulting in a steeper yield curve, which is positive for banks' net interest margin. Last but not least, negative interest rates lowers the cost of loans, and therefore support loan demand. It also lowers the cost of capital, which encourages investment. It also lowers discount rate on asset prices, boosting valuations. All these advantages do not mean that negative interest rates are the cure to what ails the global economy. Monetary policymakers need a helping hand from expansionary fiscal policy too, in order to control negative interest rate policies that have been carried out.